Hello everybody, and welcome to this short video presentation on Margaret Thatcher. The reason I've chosen to make this video is because she's in the news a lot at the moment. She died a few days ago, so the debate has opened up again as to whether or not she was a great Prime Minister or a terrible Prime Minister. Now, what I'm going to do is try and explain to the best of my ability in such a short space of time how it is that she came to be such a hated Prime Minister and such a loved Prime Minister at the same time. Now, first of all, I would hasten to add, I was 4 years old when Margaret Thatcher resigned, and all I know about it is what I've read in books, and I'm not a proper historian or anything, so yeah, if you really want to know the real ins and outs of Margaret Thatcher, go and get history books. Don't just rely on what some random guy on YouTube's saying. But I'll try and go over the basics. First of all, to understand why her policies were so controversial, I'll have to explain the state of politics that Britain had bought into since the Second World War. The main one was an idea of Kenzi and Economics. Now, this was the idea that half the economy is owned by the government and the other half is owned by private individuals. The private sector, owned by private individuals, would try and spur growth by encouraging competition and that sort of thing. But the public sector, is just there to provide the services that people need, whether it be public transport, electricity, telecoms, whatever. But also to try and keep people in work, because they weren't run for profit, they could afford just to employ people for the sake of employing people. Now, this was really an attempt to try and avoid anything like the Great Depression from ever happening again, and avoiding that devastating level of unemployment that existed. So the first thing Margaret Thatcher does when she gets elected in 1979 is to start selling off the public industries. Now, the first thing that these companies did, these new owners did, as soon as they looked at the companies, was thought, right, these are massively overstaffed. This is what's keeping these companies from being profitable, is the amount of people they've got working for them. So they start to sack lots of people. So as a result of that, in Margaret Thatcher's first term as Prime Minister, over 1 million people lost their jobs. Now, obviously, that's not a very popular move to make. It especially was very badly received in Scotland, where a huge proportion of the working population were employed by these industries, namely coal, steel and shipbuilding. Not just in Scotland, but in the north of England as well. But Scotland really personifies the hatred that a lot of the United Kingdom had for Margaret Thatcher. That's not to say that obviously all Scottish people and all Northern English people are against Margaret Thatcher. If you've been searching Margaret Thatcher on YouTube, you will have probably come across a user called Thatcher I Scott, who, as the name's quite self-explanatory, and he's a very, very ardent supporter of Margaret Thatcher. But nonetheless, it has to be said, she is extremely unpopular in Scotland, and largely out of this policy, but she did a lot of other things as well that really got Scotland's back up. I'll go a bit more into that later on. I'm going to try and run through this presentation chronologically. Now, in spite of the massive unemployment that this brought about, employment was already quite bad. It pushed the unemployment figures over 3 million, which is the worst that it had been since the Great Depression. But in spite of all this, the economy grew by 400%. So this really reinforced the idea that the Conservative Party are a party for the rich, and that even though the economy is growing, because these figures have got through like GDP and that sort of thing, the working population, the working classes, are getting screwed in the process because there's no jobs for them. So that was one thing that really made her very unpopular. The reason she sold off the public industries, there's two main reasons for it. The first one is just the ideology of it. She was very much against the government owning industries on general principle. She was inspired very much by a book called The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich von Hayek, who argued that the government having too much control in finances and industry and that sort of thing inevitably leads to tyranny. And that was something that people could see in Soviet Russia, which of course this is 1980s when the Berlin Wall is still up and it's still a very east-west world. So some people were agreeing with that, and across the spectrum, not just the rich, but working class people as well, could see where she was going and supported it. Needless to say, the working classes, on the most part, didn't like it at all. Now, there was also not just the ideological idea, but there was also the second reason was the fact that the government was in a lot of financial trouble. So she had to cut public spending. So she was selling off these unprofitable industries, trying to get them going again, and thus saving money for the government. Now, because they were making these government cuts, she also cut social benefits, like unemployment benefits. Now, of course, that's going to be hugely unpopular when your policies are directly putting people out of work, and yet at the same time you're cutting the amount of benefits that they're getting as well. So, yeah, she was, in the early 80s, she was a hugely unpopular Prime Minister. Later, the leader of the Labour Party said that she was the most hated Prime Minister that Britain had ever known. Now, obviously, he's the leader of the Labour Party, so he's going to try and find bad things to say about her. But even then, that's quite a claim to make about any Prime Minister. But it wasn't without foundation. But in spite of all this, in 1983, she wins a landslide election victory. Now, the reason for that has generally been attributed to the Falklands War. Late in 1982, the Argentinians invaded the Falkland Islands. Now, her response was to, no hesitation, immediately send a task force out there to reclaim the islands, which they did successfully. But a lot of people, her detractors, were looking at her and saying, hang on, you've not got the money to support the public industry, you've not got the money to carry on paying social benefits, but you've got the money to send a task force halfway across the world to the South Atlantic to defend some islands that have very little economic and political importance. What's going on here? So that got people's backs up a lot, and it made her look like a bit of a warmonger because the Falkland Islands were so insignificant politically and economically. But there was also a huge amount of people. This actually really boosted her popularity because it restored a lot of pride in being British. A lot of people were very, yeah, we're British. We don't stand up. We don't lay down for this sort of thing. We stand up against people that try and bully us. You know, it's a very, very big thing in for those of you outside of Britain. It's a very big thing in British culture that's how we like to see ourselves. We stood up against the Nazis. We stood up against Napoleon. We stood up against the Spanish Armada, even though the odds were against us. So, yeah, this brought up a lot of pride, and a lot of people started to really admire Margaret Thatcher. The one thing that is struck is that again brings up a lot of issues is the sinking of the Belgrano, which was an Argentinian ship that she directly herself gave the order to sink, even though it wasn't in the war zone and it was facing the opposite direction to the British fleet. But the information she had was that it was, while that was true, it was taking a sort of, I don't know what the military term would be, but they were basically trying to make it look like they weren't heading towards the British fleet, but they actually were. They were sort of going around like that, and there was another ship as well coming in from the north, and they were going to try and get the British fleet on both sides. So she gave the order for the ship to be torpedoed. Now that raised a lot of controversy. But nonetheless, the British won the war, the Argentinians surrendered, and the people of Britain loved it. It was just such a boost to British patriotism. So a lot of people have attributed that to the 1983 election victory, which was a landslide. It was the biggest in years. Now, obviously, as I said, she was very unpopular. Not a lot of people believed that she was a good Prime Minister, and was not happy that they numbered with her for potentially another 5 years. Not least was a man called Arthur Scargill. Now, Arthur Scargill was the leader of the Miners' Union, and in 1984 he called he called a strike for the miners. This was born. The mining industry was one of those industries that was owned by the government. They still weren't able to sell it because it was seen as poison to a lot of private investors. It was seen as a very unprofitable industry, and that there was nothing that could be done for it. So she eventually brought in a guy called Ian McGregor, whose job it was to try and make it profitable again. And of course he was saying we need to make pit closures, we need to make redundancies. This did not go down well with Arthur Scargill at all. The way I've often viewed the miners' strike is it's what happens when an unstoppable force hits an immovable object. Margaret Thatcher was determined she was going to make these cuts to the mining industry. Arthur Scargill was determined she was not. So the strike wildly divided public opinion. I've never seen any surveys nationwide, but I have seen surveys made in individual towns around Britain. Now, this was now in some towns you'll get like 80% pro miners. In other towns you'll get 80% against the miners. So it's very, very difficult to know exactly where the country stood on this issue. This is again made it very unpopular in Scotland. There's a lot of mining communities in Scotland. I myself lived for quite a few years in a town called Lochgelly, which is in Fife and was once a mining community, and it's still a very, very bitter issue. There's a monument there to the miners. Yeah, a lot of people saw it as a terrible, terrible thing, and it still is seen as a terrible, terrible thing. So, yeah, one of the reasons that it's viewed by a lot of people with a lot of favour is because it was seen as standing up against the unions. Now, another thing that had been happening in Britain since the end of the war, both Conservatives and Labour alike had decided that the unions should be advisors to the government. They should act in an advisory capacity. However, others people argued that they had become too powerful, and some people have argued, not without foundation, that the unions had the power to topple governments. The Conservative Edward Heath government, even the Labour government under James Callaghan, it was blamed on the amount of strikes. The 70s was dominated by strikes. Pretty much all the prime ministers that you look at, that is the main complaint against them, that it was just strikes all the way through. There's also stories that unions were blackmailing people into joining their unions, and there were no laws to protect people from this happening. So that was another thing that people respected Margaret Thatcher for, that she stood up against the unions, and she also passed a lot of laws to restrict the power of the unions. Now, of course, not everybody saw that as a good thing. Some people who already thought that Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives were very, very anti-working class people, and now they're taking away their defence, the unions which are there to defend them. So yeah, that made her very, very unpopular. And popular at the same time. But another thing that happened, obviously another group of people that were very, very unhappy with Margaret Thatcher being re-elected was the IRA, who tried to assassinate her in Brighton in 1984 by planting a bomb in the hotel that she was staying at for the Labour conference, I beg your pardon, for the Conservative conference. She was literally within feet. If she had been a few feet to the left or right, she probably would have been killed. Well, she would have been killed, there's no probably about it. But in spite of all that, in spite of the fact that she had been through this horrific experience, that some of her friends had been killed, some of her friends were either recovering or dying in hospital, she still, the very next day, continued with the Conservative conference and gave the speech that she was expected to give, the keynote speech. And so this really inspired people. They thought, wow, what a woman, you know, she's been through this horrific ordeal, she's probably been up all night, you know, not had any sleep, and next day, unfaulted, she referenced obviously the bombing a number of times in her speech. It's on YouTube if you search, I think it's just search Brighton bombing speech, Margaret Thatcher, and she's very much saying, we will not let terrorism defeat us. So yeah, it was a very, very important, very, very inspirational thing for a lot of people. Now, another thing that she did that was very, very controversial was she sold off a lot of council houses. For those of you outside of Britain, council houses are houses that are subsidised by the government so that the poorer classes have a place to live. But she sold them very, very cheaply as well. Now, on the plus side of that, it meant that a lot of people for the very first time were able to own their own homes, and it really put them on the property ladder. Now, this was seen as a big step forward in social mobility. For the first time, it was given a lot of people to own their own homes. But on the negative side, people were arguing that right, where are the poorer classes going to live now? You know, that you've sold off the government housing. What's happening now? And obviously now that is even still an issue. A lot of people are saying we don't have the houses for the poorer classes, and it's a massive problem now. Well, a lot of people say it's a massive problem. I don't know the facts and figures myself, but yeah, it makes it very controversial. Now, in spite of that, in 1987 there was another election. The economy was doing quite well. She won another election victory. First, I think she's the only Prime Minister of the 20th century to win 3 consecutive election victories. It wasn't as big as 1987, but still. Now, the economy was doing very well. There was a recession in 1987, but on the whole, the economy was on the up and up. And a lot of people are obviously profiting from this. But on the negative side, a lot of people were also seeing this as a very negative thing, that it was promoting greed. If you YouTube, Margaret, end of the video. If you YouTube search Glenda Jackson's response during the debate on whether or not she should have a private funeral, she is incredibly scathing about this, and she very passionately talks about how she felt it was a bad thing that society that she created of look after number one, and greed and all this sort of thing. Now, where you come down on that, obviously, I guess, is a point of personal philosophy. But what really brought her downfall, and I think was probably, I very rarely see a positive positive look at this, is the poll tax, or the community charge, as it was officially known. Now, it was replacing the rate system, which was a system of local government taxes, which everybody agreed was outdated and it was in dire need of reform. So she brings in the community, well, she wants to bring in the community charge, which was a non-progressive tax system. That means that everybody pays the same, whether you're the poorest of the poor or a millionaire, you are paying the same amount of tax, local government tax. Now, this was seen as very unfair and very much just a way of having a dig at the poor, because of course proportionally they were paying more than the rich would. And again, this adds to why she was very, very unpopular in Scotland. She rolled it out, she tested it in Scotland, and a lot of people in Scotland, it's still a very, very angry issue for Scottish people. If you bring it up, they'll get very angry, because they were thinking, why should we be the guinea pigs? Which is not an unreasonable point of view to have. So, yeah, and an event, but even though it was very unpopular, she decides to roll it out in the United Kingdom as a whole. But the result of this was riots, particularly in London. There was a massive riot that went on for a long time. Now, because of this, now this is late in 1990, and there's an election due in 1991. So a lot of Conservative members are getting very concerned that this is going to push them too far. They've survived a lot of unpopular policies, and they've been able to survive for 11 years in government. But now a lot of people are thinking it's not going to happen this time. They are going to get voted out. So Michael Heseltine challenged Margaret Thatcher to the leadership of the party, and had a lot of support from a party. So this eventually Margaret Thatcher realised that she wasn't going to win, and she stepped down as the Prime Minister and of course leader of the Conservative Party. And that was the end of her Prime Ministership. Now, Margaret Thatcher is loved by the Conservative Party today because she really reinvented the Conservative Party. These aren't traditional Conservative policies that she was bringing up. Former Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan said that her selling off of private industry was like selling off the family silver. He was very much against it. I won't give my opinion as to what Margaret Thatcher, as to whether or not I think Margaret Thatcher was a good Prime Minister or a bad Prime Minister. As I say, I was just trying to give an objective appraisal, and I hope my opinion ever didn't come through in my tone. yeah, if you thought this was a helpful video, I'm very happy. If I thought I put you to sleep, I apologise, although you probably just didn't watch me if that was the case. But yes, hope you all have a good day.